Hello, and welcome to this World Geography online training content video brought to you by the Georgia Department of Education. In this video, we will be addressing Georgia Standards of Excellence SSWG 2B, dealing with the role of language in identity and how it can unify or divide people. Let's take a look at the standard and element we will address in this video. SSWG 2 asks teachers to teach students to evaluate how the physical and human characteristics of places and regions are connected to human identities and cultures. Element B asks teachers to teach students to examine how language can be central to identity and a unifying or a divisive force. For example, Bantu, French Canadians, Quebecois, and Basques. Let's unpack that a little bit. The standard is essentially asking, how are land and people of a place related to the culture there? Now, let's unpack element B. This element is basically asking, what role does language play in the identity of people, and how can it be a unifying or dividing force? In fact, these questions could be used as essential questions for and within a unit of instruction on this standard and element. It is important for students to understand the important role language plays in the culture of any place. Language is usually one of the first cultural identifiers and plays a vital role in the cooperation or conflict of different groups of people. Let's first take a look at the role of language as being central to the identity of a person and/or a group of people. When I teach about the importance of language, I often tell the story of when I had the very fortunate opportunity to study abroad in Paris about 15 years ago. My friend Tyler had convinced me that I should go with him on this study abroad, not knowing a single word of French. He assured me it would be okay. And, for the most part, he was right. While I attended intensive inclusion French classes at l'Alliance Française, I lived with a sweet elderly woman named Madame Carcassonne on a top-floor flat in Le 16e, or the 16th arrondissement of Paris, near the Arc de Triomphe. I could see La Tour Eiffel, or Eiffel Tower, from our balcony. It was some of the best months of my youth. Madame Carcassonne would force me to learn French. She did so by making my dinner dependent on my ability to communicate. She would write a list of things we needed for dinner, in French of course, and send me off to several local specialty stores to get what we needed. If I wanted to eat, I had to figure it out. She was wise in knowing that I would learn French quickly if my dinner depended on it, and I did. The first few times I was helpless. I was surrounded by people who I could not even begin to understand, and they could barely understand me. In my first few trips, I quickly learned the phrase, "Parlez-vous anglais?" Do you speak English? You can only imagine the joy on my face when a kind clerk in one of the specialty stores responded in heavily accented English, "Yes." Why was I so joyful? Because somebody could understand me. I could identify with somebody. All of a sudden, I didn't feel as much like an outsider, a foreigner. And when I heard another person in a store or on the metro speaking English, there was an instant connection. I also quickly learned the French people were much more inclined to help me if I gave a genuine effort in speaking their language, and maybe even more importantly, using the correct accent. In so doing, they were asking me to identify with them. Language certainly plays a central role in the identity of a person and a group of people. Now let's take a look at how language can be both a unifying and divisive force. There is debate about how much language actually plays a role as a unifying or dividing force. and this may actually make for an interesting discussion in a classroom. How much does a common language bring a group of people together? Or, how much does the lack of a common language divide people? I think we can all agree that when you speak the same language as another person, there is better communication. However, better communication does not always mean that there is a lack of divisiveness. Anyhow, let's start with how language can be a unifier and look at one specific example. There are literally hundreds, maybe close to 1,000 different ethnic groups of people in sub-Saharan Africa. However, this large block of people is often referred to as Bantu people because most of them speak some derivative of the Bantu language, Swahili and Zulu, for example. It was the Bantu migration of hundreds of years from Central Africa down and throughout most of sub-Saharan Africa that led to the Bantu language being a unifying factor for these people. Now, to be sure, there has been conflict amongst different people groups who speak a Bantu language, Rwanda, for example. Nevertheless, the Bantu languages can be viewed as a unifying force in sub-Saharan Africa. Now let's look at some examples of how language can be divisive. The French and English have had their fair share of conflict in Europe over the centuries. Additionally, at the height of North American colonialism, the French and English fought over control of the continent. While the French mostly lost this conflict after the French and Indian War and the sale of the Louisiana Territory to the United States, large contingents of French people remained in the northern part of the continent, stretching from Hudson Bay to and past the St. Lawrence River. Today, this area is the Canadian province of Quebec. There, the majority of people speak French and are referred to as Québécois. Meanwhile, the majority of the rest of the people in Canada speak English. The Québécois have attempted to separate from Canada over the years as part of something called the Quebec Sovereignty Movement. In the 1980s and 90s, 2 referendums failed, although by slim margins, to create an independent Quebec. It has mostly been a diplomatic movement, but in the 1960s there was a violent aspect. The reasons behind this desire for independence are largely centered around culture, specifically language. The separatists believe that the best way to protect the French language and culture in North America is to become independent of Canada. This is a prime example of how language can sometimes be divisive. Euskalginak in the Basque language literally means one who has the Basque language. The Basque region straddles the Pyrenees Mountains on the Bay of Biscay, overlapping parts of France and Spain. The Basque people are indigenous people of Europe and are mostly a stateless nation. They have been unable to gain independence from either France or Spain. Although Spain has established an autonomous area in their country for the Basques to live in and partially administer. In exchange, the Basque people who live there are required to have a, quote, knowledge of Spanish. Because of policies like this, less than half of the Basque people still speak their native language to this day. Although the Basque live in and are surrounded by Romance language speakers, they have a unique, non-Romantic language and culture. Similar to the Québécois, this has led to diplomatic measures for independence and even violence in the past. While there are different levels of desire for independence throughout the Basque country, just like in Quebec, it is clear that language is one of the primary driving forces behind this desire for independence. As we can see, language is a central part of our identity as individuals and groups of people. It can have a unifying effect, like in the case of the Bantu. However, it can have a divisive effect, like in the cases of the Quebecois and the Basque people. For this standard and element, it is important to drive home to students just how important language is in identity and causal forces. Thanks for watching.